G'day guys, Solid here. Welcome back to another video. I've had plenty of comments asking me to do a review on my 2014 Yamaha V Star 1300. Now, those who follow the channel quite often will be surprised that I've bought another cruiser, as my passion is off-road motorcycles. But when it comes to a second bike, I prefer having a road-orientated machine. So I'm going to get into why I chose this cruiser as my next bike. I've owned it a couple of months now, so I think I can do my initial impressions of how I'm getting along with the bike. So for those of you who have stumbled across this video and don't follow my channel, you might want to know that I've been riding over a decade. I do love off-road, but I've done track days on super sports. I've owned Harleys and other cruisers in the past, and I've had just about every kind of bike you could think of. So I'm well placed to give a fairly well-rounded review on this bike, so let's get into it. So this is my new to me Yamaha V Star 1300. It's a 2014. I got it used. It came with that nice Cobra slip-on pipe that you can see there in the video. It also came with some hard mount saddlebags, which I don't have fixed to the bike at this time. All round, it's a fantastic bike. It's exactly what I wanted out of a motorcycle, and I'm going to go through in this video what I think this bike does very well. I'm also going to go through what I think this bike is lacking, and then how I found its ownership and what application I use it for. So we're going to jump out on the road, and I'm going to go through the good, the bad, and who I think this bike is aimed at, and does this bike make sense as a motorcycle in 2020, as I know Japanese cruisers really aren't the fashionable choice.
Let's see how she sounds.
So let's get into the good of this motorcycle. It's a very relaxed motorcycle to ride. The engine characteristics at big 1300 V twin just make it a very nice bike to trundle along on. But being a 1300 V twin, it also has more than enough power to get out of its own way. It's not going to be blistering speed like a super sport, but you just have torque everywhere that you need it. And it's very nice to have a motorcycle for touring and taking a pillion that's got the kind of torque where you don't have to down gear and you can just tear off whenever you need to, which is very nice feature to have. So the engine characteristics I absolutely love. Of course, it's not the biggest V-twin, you can get more power, but this is more than enough to have fun and get the job done. Another major plus with the V Star 1300 is it does have quite a good fuel range. I get about 320 kilometers to a tank. Now that's not amazing, but it's definitely a lot better than some other cruisers, so I'm happy to report that the tank range on this is pretty decent, and I'd put that into it's good enough for touring. You might need to carry a couple extra liters with you, but it's pretty decent, and I don't find myself having fuel anxiety on big trips. Another major plus to this bike, and a major factor as to why I purchased it, is the comfort of the bike. Now I'm not talking just about the suspension, I'm talking about the seat. It's very nice for a stock seat, although I will note the pillion seat, whilst comfortable, is quite slippery. My wife noted that at the traffic lights, if I got too spirited with a takeoff, she was really clinging on for dear life. So you might need to get a sissy bar if you don't want to leave your partner at the traffic lights. But also the big fat tyres on this bike really do a lot to soak up the bumps and make it a nice plush, comfortable experience. The floorboards are also a nice addition, which just add to the comfort. This bike just kind of wafts along, like it's basically like riding a lazy boy with a V-twin in it. It's very comfortable, very relaxed, very stable as well because of the weight, so it's just a very reassuring and comfortable ride. So let's talk about the suspension, which is surprisingly competent given the type of motorcycle it is. Often cruisers, I've found, they tend to have very rigid suspension to cope with the heavy weight of the motorcycle, and being that I'm so light, I often have some spine shattering experiences, as was my experience with the Harley Iron 1200 that I used to own. Now this is quite good. The suspension is very plush. Now I suspect some of that has to do with the fat tyres on this that soak up a lot of the bumps, but the suspension deals very well with everyday riding. Harsh bumps it soaks up very nicely, but it also does a great job of keeping the bike under control when you've got a pillion and luggage on top. Often I find when you put a pillion and some luggage on, that's when you start overwhelming the suspension on a motorcycle, and it doesn't cope easily in that situation. But I can report that the V Star 1300, even without any preload adjustment, deals quite well with a pillion and some luggage, and it doesn't feel like it's overwhelmed at all. So the suspension I'm going to definitely put in the plus column. It also doesn't dive too much under heavy braking, which is a nice change for a cruiser as well. It's not amazing suspension, don't get me wrong, it's not overly adjustable and perfect in every situation. It's just surprisingly competent for the price point. Another thing that I love about the V Star 1300 is the speedometer's location. One of my pet peeves with cruisers that I've had in the past is when they mount the things on the tank, which is infuriating to me because then I have to crane my neck down to constantly see my speed. And when you're getting a bit spirited, it's quite easy on a big bike like this to get way above the speed limit if you're not careful. And with speeding fines and the police being so harsh in Australia, you really need to be on top of your speeds. So having it mounted up in my peripheral vision is way more helpful to me, so that's another massive plus, even though it seems like a small little feature. The other great thing about the V Star is the 1300cc engine. It's very smooth, it's very torquey, it's got more than enough power everywhere you need it, but the biggest thing I love about it is compared to my Harley, even though they're similar CCs, I think the V Star really punches above its weight and is more like a Softail than a Sportster. It's also way smoother, I don't have the fillings rattled out of my skull. So let's have a listen to the motor as I get onto the freeway here. So why is it so good out on the open road? Well, the engine just isn't very stressed at these speeds, so it's very comfortable, it's not high revving, it's smooth, you're not getting vibes through the bars. It's also very solid and stable on the road because of its weight, and it's low slung to the ground with a center of gravity. It just trucks along on the highway very nicely. It's also surprisingly nimble for a big cruiser, so that's another nice feature as well. If you're doing lots of highway riding, I would recommend getting a screen. It's the first thing I'm going to be purchasing for this bike, as the wind buffeting when the wind does start to get high is pretty intense. Now that's not a criticism of this specific bike, that's any bike, but I feel like it's especially so for cruisers where you've got your hands and your feet out front. You're kind of a human parachute, so I would recommend a screen if you're planning on doing lots of touring. So one of the noted concerns for a lot of people with these motorcycles is the 5-speed gearbox. I'm happy to report that the 5 speeds is actually pretty damn decent, at least out on the open road where you would expect 5th gear to run out of steam. Because it's got such a wide ratio gearbox, you really don't miss that 6th gear. I don't find myself hunting for 6th gear like I have on other bikes. The Sportster I had, you very much are always looking for 6th gear, but the spread on this, it's pretty damn good, so I'm quite happy with the 5-speed box. It does come undone eventually though, and that's where we're going to lean over into the bad of this motorcycle. So I find 1st gear to 2nd gear, it's a little bit cumbersome in that when you're doing very slow speed work, say around a roundabout like it's coming up just up ahead, 2nd gear is just a little too tall to get around there, and 2nd gear is much smoother because, like most modern EFI motorcycles, the V Star is quite snatchy in 1st, so you kind of lurch around if you're not too gentle with the throttle. So I find myself having to modulate the clutch in 1st gear to get around these roundabouts smoothly. It would either be nice just to have 2nd gear be a little more suited to slow speed maneuvering like this, or have 1st gear they had have put more time and effort into getting a smoother 1st and not so snatchy a throttle. But that is a problem with most modern EFI bikes, so it's hardly a criticism of just this bike, and something I plan to fix with a fuel programmer or a tuner down the road, as I already do have the pipe, so it does need a tune, but just keep that in mind. The next criticism I have for the V Star is the same for most big cruisers, and as you can see here, it's the turning circle. Now, I did do a bit of a dog's breakfast of this one admittedly, but I just wanted to use it as an illustration of you do need quite a bit of space to turn this around, although I did kind of half decide to keep going the other way midway through, so that didn't do me any favors. But the turning circle is quite a wide berth, so if you're in a tight narrow street and you need to turn around, expect to do an Austin Powers 300 point turn, but it's not a big deal really. It's still a motorcycle, so it's fairly maneuverable. As with most big cruisers, the brakes aren't fantastic. They're good enough to get the job done, but if you are loaded up with luggage and you have a pillion on the back and you need to hit the brakes pretty hard, it does take a little bit of time to slow down. It's definitely not super sport or even adventure bike or commuter bike kind of brakes. It does take a bit to get all that weight to slow down, which is a bit of a disappointment. I would have liked to have seen a bit more bite out of the front brakes, but it can be fixed. I'll just put some steel braided lines on and see how I go from there, but just be warned that you do need a bit of time to slow down if you're riding spiritedly. I'm going to put splitting traffic in the bad column for the V Star. It is a very wide bike, it is quite heavy, so you've got to split gingerly and just make sure you've got a line to fit through there. That's why you see my mirrors turned up the way they are. It's just so the profile of the bike is a little skinnier. So splitting can be done, but it isn't the best bike for that exact purpose. So let's head back to the garage and I'm going to talk about how I think this would suit someone upgrading from a V Star 650 or a Harley Sportster, and why I chose a cruiser in 2020, as I know they're the unfashionable choice at the moment. So let's head over to the garage where we can get into the nitty-gritty of that. So to wrap this video up, I've owned this bike for a couple of months now and it really is growing on me more and more. I love this bike from the outset, but sometimes I've found in ownership of motorcycles that honeymoon period wears off after about 100 kilometers as you learn all the failings of this motorcycle. And that's not so much the case with this. I think this is going to be quite a long-term motorcycle. It's really growing on me more and more. The more riding I do, the more I find myself really appreciating what this bike is good at, and that's comfortable touring and commuting, and just the fact that you get that V-twin experience without the paint shaker rattling of a Harley, to me is very good. I know some guys want that raw V-twin feeling and they want their fillings rattled out of their skull, but that's not me. I want smooth power so that I'm not feeling like I've been shagged by Optimus Prime when I do a 600 kilometer day ride and I'm camping. I don't want to really be just wasted from fighting the bike the whole way, and that's where this bike excels. It really manages to maintain your stamina and keep your energy for those long distance rides. So that was one of the major factors I chose this bike. It is quirky, so that's another reason I got it. Like I said, it isn't the obvious choice. It's not the cool choice. If you're wanting to look cool, you get a Harley or you get a Triumph to impress your mates down at the cafe. I don't really give a crap about that stuff. I just want it to be reliable, powerful, and meet all my expectations, and it's done that. So I can highly recommend the V Star 1300. If you're on a Sportster and you can't afford a Softail but you want to upgrade, or if you're on a 650 V Star, I think this makes a very logical upgrade. It's pretty much just a better version of the 650 in all ways, except for maneuverability at low speed. And yes, I have ridden a 650, so I can compare the two. The final thing I wanted to address is why I chose this over an adventure bike. And the major factor was I could get a much better example of a cruiser than I could an adventure bike, which I have owned in the past. I've had a GS, which I absolutely loved, and I'm constantly riding adventure bikes. Now, all things considered, if I could afford it, I probably would have gone with an adventure bike. But given what I was looking at in the second-hand market, I could get a much better example of a cruiser than I could an adventure bike. And when you think about it, and what I really wanted this bike for was road touring and commuting, I didn't really need an adventure bike. So the cruiser is just as good at doing those adventure touring as an adventure bike is. The only minus is that you can't take this as down many dirt roads as you could a GS 1250 or a Super Tenere, but I'm going to be doing that on my dual sport anyway, so As a touring bike, this makes a great option and the uncool choice, as cruisers aren't very popular now. So I like going against the grain and doing what everyone else isn't. So that's why I chose the V Star 1300. Anyway, guys, that's enough of me prattling on about motorcycles for now. I'll get out of your way. Hopefully that's helped you if you're thinking about getting a V Star 1300. I certainly am really enjoying my ownership experience. I will do a long-term video once I've done some camping trips and owned this for a far longer period of time. But until then, this is my first impressions on V Star 1300, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch you later, guys.